Welcome to Contemporary First Nation Voices, NBE 3C, Grade 11 English, College Level. This is Jillian Percy, and we are back from March break. Hope you had a wonderful March break. Today is Class 20, and we're beginning work on Lesson 11. Today we're looking at 30, 31, and possibly 32, just kind of depending on how the day goes. As always, here are all the ways to contact us. At the studio, 1-800-465-7144. The office, 1-800-667-3703, extension 2211. My email is jillian.percy@nnec.on.ca. My Facebook is capital G, capital P-E-R-C-Y, space W-A-H-S-A. If you reach out to me on Facebook, please, beyond just doing the friend request, always send me a message like, hey, this is Stephanie. I am in your whatever class, and I just want to introduce myself, or I had a question, just so I can look up your file real quick. And I know who you are, right? Because I do get kind of random bots sometimes message me, and Facebook it's only for my students. That's not my personal one. If you are wanting to look at or listen to previously recorded classes, there's two different YouTube channels. There's my teacher YouTube channel, which is also called G Percy Wassa. And then there's the school Wassa Distance Education YouTube channel that has all of my classes and all the other teachers' classes as well. So it's kind of your one-stop shop. So if you're taking a lot of courses, that can be an easy way to do it. Okay, how to hand in work. This is probably the most common question I get, which is why I kind of talk about it every single day. First of all, if you have a learning center, there is a DEC at your learning center. Ask them to scan it for you and have them email it to me. Always hang on to your originals, because this course and a lot of other courses also have things we need to do, portfolios, or things where maybe you weren't happy with an assignment and you want to raise your marks. So hang on to them. You don't want to lose those. You can also fax it to me, 1-800-463-7852. That's for the Ontario. If you are outside of Ontario, 1-877-990-2023. You can also scan it yourself using a scanner app on your phone and then send it to me, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. You can mail it to me if you really have to, but this is not my suggested way. If you do this, you have to mail the photocopies, not the originals. Keep in mind, this will take a long time to get to me, and it may take a few more weeks for me to mark it, and things do sometimes get lost. This is a slow way to do it. If you have if you've done your assignments on Google Docs, you can share your documents with me through Google Docs. If you did your document on Word, you can also just save it and send it to me in an email as well. Now, sometimes people are choosing to hand in assignments by photograph. This is not the best way, but if that's what you've got, then that'll work. Make sure your photo is clear though, not be blurry, because I can't read it if it's too blurry. Preferably make sure your assignment is done in pen or typed so it's dark enough for me to read. Pencil can be very hard to read on a photograph. Your photo should be taken with your phone parallel to the assignment so the writing doesn't get distorted. And please don't just click share. It comes up in a very odd size on the computer because that's meant to go to another phone. And also don't cut and paste it into the body of the email. Instead, save it as a file and then attach it to an email and send the email to me. Whenever you hand in work, please send it to studentwork@nnec.ca. You can include me in the email, but that student work is where everything has to go, because the secretary can log that you submitted the work, and then it is in our student work database where it could be retrieved again if something happened, if another teacher took over the course, if you don't finish the course this year and you need to find your assignments for next year. Or sometimes people have had their assignments tore up by the dog or the baby or whatever. So it's just a safe way to have an extra copy of this. If an assignment asks you for both a rough and a good draft, please label which one is which and include them both in the same email. I do compare them. So that's kind of important to know. Okay, so how to scan documents using your phone. Now, this one is, you can download any kind of scanner app. I've used Adobe Scan. That's what's on my personal phone. It's free. Adobe's a very reliable company. It's pretty easy to use. But if you have a different scanner app that you're already using, that's fine. This is a helpful poster that they put together. This is not my poster. Once you've installed it, you open it, hold your phone over the file. Now, see there at a bit of an angle? You don't want to be at an angle if you can help it, because it'll make the stuff down here at the bottom where it's angled is going to look kind of wonky. You can adjust the borders if they're not quite right, so you don't end up having, your table on there or a blanket or whatever you're taking the picture on. If your assignment is more than one page, just keep repeating step 2 and 3 and 2 and 3 until you've finished all the pages you need for that assignment. Then tap continue. Now it'll let you preview it. You can make sure everything's nice and crisp and clear. If things got out of order, you can put it into order for me. If you need to crop anything, that's fine too. Then you save the PDF, give it a name, usually obviously the name of the assignment, like assignment 11 NBE 3C. Then save it. You can put it in your Google Drive, your Dropbox, your phone, wherever you want to. Now you've got it, and you can write me an email and send it along to me. Okay, so we are in week 6. Now, as always, these weekly plans are kind of my estimate because I can't always tell ahead of time how long it's going to take me to talk about assignments. So today I've got 31, maybe we'll get to 32. If not, we'll get to it another day. I do not have class tomorrow. I've got to be away in Kenora for some medical assignments. I apologize. But then I'll just make up the class on Friday. So we will see how we get. Some assignments have been added, changed, or eliminated, so the numbers I am showing may not match your originals. You are welcome to hand in either the original or the revised version until the end of the school year. However, if I do suggest that you call me and get the revised version if possible, it's generally better. Either I've made the assignment clearer, shorter, or I've added assignments that cover expectations that weren't being covered, okay? The big thing too is because this recording kind of sits on YouTube forever, I do want to point out that if you are taking this course and it is September 2025 or later, then you will definitely need to make sure you get the new version if you haven't gotten it already, okay? All right, Unit 3. Unit 3 is Truth and Reconciliation. So we are on lesson 11. So this unit, today's lesson, but really the entire unit, is dealing with issues of residential school, including descriptions of abuse, racist behavior, racist language. Some students or anyone out in the radio audience may find this really distressing to listen to or to read or discuss. If you find yourself triggered or upset or having flashbacks or any kind of bad feelings due to this kind of stuff, please do not suffer alone. Reach out for help to the phone number below. So the 24-hour National Survivors Crisis Line, 1-866-925-4419. Okay, so I want to kind of go here because some people, not everybody, but some people are kind of like, oh, why are we even talking about this stuff? I just want to forget about that stuff. I don't like how it makes me feel. Sorry, I don't know why it's telling me this. It seems to be perfectly safe. But anyways, so I kind of wanted to just kind of discuss in general, why do we look at history that was painful, that was racist, that was wrong? What is the point? It's behind us. Why bother looking at it now? And so this is kind of a little discussion of that. The guy who was talking, or someone else who was talking, said, I became preoccupied not only with the unaccustomed sense of freedom, but also with the paralyzing horror that had come over me at various times when confronted with the traces of destruction reaching far back into the past. W.G. Sebald. 2 years ago, I was halfway through earning a degree in history, learning about the kinds of stories people tell in their historical scholarship. I was learning how to write well and how to stitch together an image of a person or a place or an event from what had been left behind. This is how we earned our degrees. Find a dead man, woman, or place worthy of our time. Many pages later, Central plus P, and then a red grading pen. And what happened between our subjects and ourselves was the stuff of one-page reflections and seminar discussions. Some of us found pieces of advice hidden in our syllabi. I found what I needed in The Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald. Being preoccupied with the paralyzing horror of our violent human past was something I could understand. For those of us inclined by training or disposition or both to see the violence in the everyday, Sebald had a suggestion. He recommends literally walking it off. Walk and remember and write. Writing about the past means engaging with the before an empire fell, or a river was polluted, or genocide was committed and perhaps forgotten. We live in the post-war, the post-9/11, the post-unthinkable. So to go to the before means either living for a time in a space of what could have been, or telling the story of how it all fell apart. But people who decide to study this violent history, people who write it all down, we are also people who need to mail in tax forms or put on a pot of coffee or call our dads. And this can be difficult work, this act of entering the pre when you live in the post, and then having to be a person and hand something in by a deadline and walk away and study and do it again. For writers of color who chose to study or tell the stories of their own communities, this in-between space is made more stark by the fact that they work within a system that often speaks about them, for them, but not with them. The anthropologist Leila Abu-Lakud wrote in 1991 that the anthropologist is still defined as a being who must stand apart from the other, even when he or she seeks explicitly to bridge the gap. But what if you don't need to bridge the gap? What if your work exhausts you precisely because you are the other? Some might wonder, why can't we just do our work and take comfort in thrashing ever upstream with academic rigor and unimpeachable sources? Why muddy the waters of clear-minded analysis with self-indulgent navel-gazing? It matters because if we agree that it's generally better to have people speak for themselves and their own communities, then we need to pay more attention to the particular conditions of writing about something both near and far away, how it affects scholars and other people from these communities, and what it costs them. In The Rings of Saturn, W.G. Sebald recounts a journey he took a year before his hospitalization on foot through coastal East Anglia. As he walks, he remembers a lakeside manor causes him to recall the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. A nautical museum reminds him of the mass executions at Jasenovac. Monuments do not bring to mind the splendid achievements of their builders, but rather the sordid and blood-soaked pasts that brought those achievements into being. I was incredibly relieved when I first read this passage. It wasn't just me. It seems bizarre to me now that I ever thought I was alone in feeling overwhelmed by the violence I studied. Perhaps I thought my experience was unique because we weren't talking enough about how it feels to have your own community's past discussed in a classroom. So many death warrants signed so long ago. It can be comforting to discover that a stranger's words describe your experience. This sensation of being distracted, and always distracted, by how your work is making you feel. It's not always horror. Sometimes it's discomfort. Sometimes it's a perverse joy. It might have been easier if I was studying history 150 years ago, when reconstructing narrative meant assembling the when, where, and why, and binding a volume with authority. I wouldn't have been admitted to my university 100 years ago, though. I wouldn't have been welcomed at McGill until 1884. I've read some of what has been written about the particular challenges and methodologies of writing about a violent past that one also inhabits. But what helped me more than anything else was talking with my friends and classmates who could relate. They were generous with me, sharing their experiences openly. I talked with them because I wanted to know how other young students and academics of color manage the emotional work of writing about violence and oppression that has affected their own communities, how they study and try to make sense of their own lived histories and the stories of their people. Perhaps not everyone for such a background considers their work in history to be exhausting or emotionally difficult. And if they do, they may have different ways of coping. This can mean taking care of yourself, keeping your crap together long enough to go deal with it in private. That happens to be my way, asking questions, talking with people I trust. I have known some of these students for years, others as new friends. They were all kind enough to answer my questions and share their experiences as writers, students, historians, anthropologists, political science, and people. So I'm not going to kind of go into all the kind of quotes, but I just wanted to talk about the fact that This is hard. Even professionals find this hard. And it's harder when we are kind of doing this multi-strand thing of you guys are students, so you're working on this stuff, but many of you have also lived this stuff. So um, it's not a simple writing exercise. It's talking about stuff that is very difficult and very emotional and may have been very painful to live through. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I understand that and that it's difficult. And if you guys need to reach out to that line, that's great. If you need to reach out to me, I am always happy to talk to students about anything. If you find any one assignment way too hard and it's just like, no, I can't handle that, come and talk to me. And I'd be perfectly happy to find something that's more appropriate or more emotionally doable. The thing is, I feel like we can't possibly talk about Aboriginal contemporary voices in the last 100 years and not deal with the issues of residential school and truth and reconciliation, as painful and as difficult as they are to talk about. So I apologize for anybody who's out there who might find this difficult. This is what we're going to be talking about for the next hour. So if you are listening on the radio and need to take a break and walk away, that's fine. And if you're listening on YouTube later on, you can always take a break and walk away from it as well. But I just wanted to give people a heads up before they kind of got, I don't want anyone to feel ambushed, I guess, basically. Okay, so our goal for this lesson is you're going to look at some different sources of information about the residential schools in Canada, their importance in Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, their impact on Indigenous people, and answer questions regarding the information, style, and genre of different texts. Okay, historical background. There are many, many books written on the historical background of the residential school system in Canada. A lot of them are huge. We can't possibly cover them in one course, but they are out there if you're interested. This is a very brief summary from a website, which is also a book called the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. The Canadian government and Canada's churches built the residential school system as a means to solve the, quote, Indian question, unquote, in Canada. The perceived threat and barrier posed by Indigenous peoples to the ongoing construction of the newly forming nation of Canada. They developed a system that mimicked schools in the United States and in British colonies, where governments and colonial powers used large boarding-style industrial schools to convert masses of Indigenous and poor children into Catholics and Protestants and turn them into, quote, good industrious workers, unquote. These schools were used in Ireland, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as in Sweden for Indigenous Sami children, as a way for new settlers to claim land traditionally occupied by Indigenous people all over the world. Canada adopted this model in order to enforce the adoption of European traditions, languages, and lifestyles by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. And there's a map that follows that's also from the same website. This is from February 6, 2018, and it's showing basically the residential school locations. One kind of weird thing I discovered as I was researching this lesson was, for some reason, because Newfoundland and Labrador kind of joined Canada later, a lot of the agreements that were made with the other Indigenous reservations didn't include them. So they are not necessarily on this map, even though they did exist. It's kind of a weird political thing. And I'm sorry, but this is the one map I really can find. I'm sure there's more out there, but just as kind of just a map of where they all were. I've heard different heights. I've heard that the max, there was 80. I've also heard max of like 130. So I'm not really sure. This is from a much longer article in the Canadian Encyclopedia. And the really important thing about this is it kind of talks about how just kind of it got its start really right at the very beginning almost of Canada. Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Assimilate's kind of a big word. It just means basically to kind of blend them in, but in like a taking over kind of way, right? We sometimes talk about Canada being a mosaic. This is not the mosaic idea. This is the mixing pot. This is trying to, what they sometimes refer to as horribly taking the Indian out of the child, right? Although the first residential facilities were established in New France, which later became Quebec, this term usually refers to the schools that were established after 1880. However, like I said, they existed for quite a long time. Residential schools were created by Christian churches and the Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert Indigenous youth and to assimilate them into Canadian society. However, the schools disrupted lives and communities, causing long-term problems among Indigenous peoples. The last residential school closed in 1996. Grolier Hall closed in 1997, but it was not considered a state-run residential school that year. Since then, former students have demanded recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2007 and a formal public apology by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008. In total, an estimated 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools. Okay. This is a picture of Metlakataka Indian residential school students. I'm not sure where that is. Okay, so early residential schools in New France and Upper Canada. They were first developed in New France by Catholic missionaries to provide care and schooling. However, colonial governments were unable to force Indigenous people to participate in the schools at that time, as First Nations people were largely independent, and Europeans actually depended on them economically and militarily for survival. However, residential schools became a part of government and church policy from the 1830s on, with the creation of Anglican, Methodist, and Roman Catholic institutions in Upper Canada, which later became Ontario. The oldest continuing operating residential school in Canada was the Mohawk Institute in what is now Brantford, Ontario. This began as a day school for Six Nation boys, but in 1831 it started to accept boarding students. These colonial experiments set the pattern for post-Confederation policies. So I'm using a lot of words here. Post-Confederation is after Canada became a country. So before Canada became a country, we had New France colony, we had the Upper Canada colony. They weren't what we now consider the joined up forces of Canada, okay? We call that Confederation, and a lot of things changed with Confederation. So beginning in the 1870s, both the federal government and the Plains Nations wanted to include schooling provisions in treaties, although for different reasons. Indigenous leaders hoped that Euro-Canadian schooling would help their young to learn the skills of the newcomer society and help them make a successful transition to a world dominated by the strangers. With the passage of the British North America Act in 1867 and the implementation of the Indian Act, 1876, the government was required to provide Indigenous youth with an education and to assimilate them into Canadian society. The federal government supported schooling as a way to make First Nations peoples economically self-sufficient. This is kind of ironic because they were previously self-sufficient until the Europeans came over. The underlying objective was to decrease Indigenous dependence on public funds. That's a different issue, right? In other words, they want to get rid of the reservation system there because they don't want to be having to fund it as a separate thing. The government therefore collaborated with Christian missionaries to encourage religious conversion and Indigenous economic self-sufficiency. This led to the development of an education policy after 1880 that relied heavily on custodial schools. These were not the kind of schools that Indigenous leaders had hoped to create. So they agreed that schools were needed, but they didn't really spend enough time or whatever in terms of having the same vision. They had very different ideas of what those schools were going to look like. Beginning with the establishment of 3 industrial schools in the prairies in 1883, and through the next half century, the federal government and churches developed a system of residential schools that stretched across much of the country. Most of the residential schools were in the 4 western provinces and the territories, but there were also significant numbers in northwestern Ontario and in northern Quebec. New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island had no schools, apparently because the government assumed that Indigenous people there had been assimilated into Euro-Canadian culture. At its height, around 1930, the residential school system totaled 80 institutions. The Roman Catholic Church operated about 3/5 of those schools. The Anglican Church operated one quarter, and the United and Presbyterian churches operated the remainder. Before 1925, the Methodist Church also operated residential schools, but United Church is when I think there was a whole combination of different denominations joining together, and so that kind of changed things a bit there. Isolation and assimilation. Overall, students had a negative experience at the residential schools, one that would have lasting consequences. That is, this is severely understated. I understand that. I apologize. This is kind of the official story, and I just kind of want you to be aware of that stance. Students were isolated and their culture was disparaged or scorned. They were removed from their homes and parents and were separated from some of their siblings as the schools were segregated according to gender. In some cases, they were forbidden to speak their first language, even in letters home to their parents. I think that was pretty common, actually. They're saying in some cases, but that was pretty basic one from what I understand. The attempt to assimilate children began upon their arrival at the schools. Their hair was cut, especially for the boys, and they were stripped of their traditional clothing and given new uniforms. In many cases, they were also given new names. Christian missionary staff spent a lot of time and attention on Christian practices, while at the same time they criticized or denigrated, in other words, put down, Indigenous spiritual traditions. Daniel Kennedy described his experiences at the Qu'Appelle residential school in his memoirs, published as Recollections of an Assiniboine Chief, 1972. In 1886, at the age of 12 years, I was lassoed, roped, and taken to the government school at Lebret. 6 months after I enrolled, I discovered to my chagrin that I had lost my name, and an English name had been tagged onto me in exchange. When you were brought here, the school interpreter later told me, for purposes of enrollment, you were asked to give your name. And when you did, the principal remarked that there were no letters in the alphabet to spell this little heathen's name, and no civilized tongue could pronounce it. So you can see what I'm talking about in terms of putting people down. We are going to civilize him, so we will give him a civilized name. And that was how you acquired this brand new white man's name. In keeping with the promise to civilize the little pagan, they went to work and cut off my braids, which incidentally, according to the Assiniboine traditional custom, was a token of mourning. The closer the relative, the closer the cut. After my haircut, I wondered in silence if my mother had died because they had cut my hair so close to the scalp. I looked in the mirror to see what I looked like. A Halloween pumpkin stared back at me, and that did it. If this was civilization, I didn't want any part of it. I ran away from school, but I was captured and brought back. I made 2 more attempts, but with no better luck. Realizing that there was no escape, I resigned myself to the task of learning the 3 R's. Visualize for yourself the difficulties encountered by an Indian boy who had never seen the inside of a house, who had lived in buffalo skin teepees in winter and summer, who grew up with a bow and arrow. Until the late 1950s, residential schools operated on a half-day system, in which students spent half the day in the classroom and the other at work. The theory behind this was that students would learn skills that would allow them to earn a living as adults. However, the reality was that work had more to do with running the school inexpensively, rather than providing students with vocational training. Tasks were separated by gender. Girls were responsible for housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and sewing, while boys were involved in carpentry, construction, general maintenance, and agricultural labor. I will point out at that time, that would be pretty typical anywhere. That wouldn't have just been with Indigenous. Even in families, it would be pretty typical for the girls to be only learning that and the boys to be only learning the other stuff. I took shop courses when I was in high school, and that was in, 1980s. And I was the only girl in that class, and the boys did not like it. And that was obviously 30 years later. So that was kind of part of the Western culture at the time, which I know is not necessarily true for Indigenous culture. Funding was a pressing concern in the residential school system. From the 1890s until the 1950s, the government tried constantly to shift the burden of the system onto the churches and onto the students, whose labor contributed financially to the schools. By the 1940s, it was clear to many that the half-day system had failed to provide residential students with adequate education and training. However, the half-day system was not eliminated until the late 1950s, when more funding became available owing to a strong economy. This is a picture of a residential school in Fort Resolution in the Northwest Territories, which looks like it's is it an all-girls school, or is it just kind of, oh, yeah, there's girls in the front. I think the boys are in a middle row and then more girls in the back is what it looks like. Abuse at residential schools. Many students suffered abuse at residential schools. Impatience and correction often led to excessive punishment, including physical abuse. In some cases, children were heavily beaten, chained, or confined. Some of the staff were sexual predators, and many students were sexually abused. When allegations of sexual abuse were brought forward by students, parents, or staff, the response by government and church officials was at best inadequate. The police were seldom, if ever, contacted. And even if government or church officials decided that the complaint had merit, in other words, if they believed it, the response was often simply to fire that person. So they didn't pursue it and charge them with law or put them in prison. They just like, okay, we're going to get rid of you. At other times, they didn't even do that, and they simply allowed the abuser to keep on teaching. Health, death, and disease at residential schools. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, at least 3,200 Indigenous children died in the overcrowded residential schools due to poor record keeping by the churches and federal governments. It is unlikely that we will ever know the total loss of life at residential schools. However, according to the TRC chair, Justice Murray Sinclair, I'm saying that wrong somehow, my mouth wasn't when I wanted to say that. The number may be more than 6,000. Underfed and malnourished, the students were particularly vulnerable to diseases such as tuberculosis and influenza, including the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and 19, which killed many, many, many people. Food was low in quantity and poor in quality, in large part due to concerns about the cost. Faced with limited funding, schools were instructed to observe the strictest economy. Economy means like be cheap, be stingy in all particulars. In general, school menus seem to have been both monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. According to Basil Johnston, who attended the residential school in Spanish Ontario, he was served mush, 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 sometimes lumpy, sometimes watery, with monotonous regularity every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. Moreover, research by food historian Ian Mosby, published in 2013, revealed that students at some residential schools in the 1940s and 1950s were then subjected to nutritional experiments without their consent or their consent of the parents. These studies were approved by various federal government departments and conducted by leading nutrition experts at the time. They included restricting some students' access to essential nutrients and dental care in order to assess the effect of improvements made to the diet of other students. Overall, the experiments did not seem to have resulted in any long-term benefits. I actually, because I read about this a little bit, my impression was actually it had a little bit to do with the war. They were trying to see like how little people could survive on with the war, and they chose to use these students who did not have people protecting them as kind of their guinea pigs to try this kind of stuff on. It's kind of really terrible. Nutritional deficiencies and overcrowding led to regular outbreaks of diseases at the schools. Tuberculosis and influenza were the major killers, but students were also affected by outbreaks of smallpox, measles, typhoid, diphtheria, pneumonia, and whooping cough. Remember, this is long before we had modern medicine, so things that could be treated very quickly and easily today were literally deadly at that time. In the winter of 1926 to 27, for example, 13 children died from a combination of measles and whooping cough at the Lytton School. Louise Moyne, who attended the Coppell School in the Northwest Territories, remembered one year in the early 20th century where tuberculosis was on the rampage. There was a death every month on the girls' side, and some of the boys went also. We were always taken to see the girls who had died. The sisters invariably had them dressed in light blue, and they always looked so peaceful and angelic. We were led to believe that their souls had gone to heaven, and that this would somehow lessen the grief and sadness we felt in the loss of our little schoolmates. There would be a requiem mass in the chapel, and we would all escort the body, which was lying in a simple handmade coffin, to the graveyard, which was located close to the RC church in the village. Although medical experts such as Dr. Peter Bryce, Dr. James Lafferty, Dr. O.I. Grain, and Dr. E.L. Stone recommended measures to improve health and medical treatment at the schools, these were not implemented by the government, largely due to concerns about cost and opposition by the churches. Okay, so support question 12. Below is an infographic of the timeline of the residential school history. Check out the link below and then answer the questions. We're going to kind of look at the questions first, then we'll go to the timeline real quick. Did you find the timeline useful to understand the history of residential schools? Explain why or why not. 2, in your opinion, why did the creator of the timeline include images of the original historical documents, sometimes called primary documents? Do you think it was helpful in understanding the information presented? Explain why it was or was not helpful to you. And in your opinion, would the information in this timeline be more effectively presented in a paragraph instead? Explain why or why it would not be more effective to you. Okay, hang on, let me see. So I know we're doing a lot of background because I find the unit kind of just jumps into the Reconciliation Commission, but if you don't really understand the background, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. So 1831, the Mohawk Indian Residential School opens in Brantford, Ontario. That's kind of down in the Toronto area, and I presume that's a picture of it there. 1876, the Indian Act is created, which gives government the exclusive right to create legislation regarding Indians and Indian lands. This act identifies who is an Indian and establishes related legal rights. This part about being who qualifies was really crucial because they had whole like regulations about if you married out, you no longer had that special status, and you didn't have these, you didn't have those things. It was very controlling in a very horrible way. 1883, Sir John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of residential schools in the Canadian West. Sir Hector Langevin, Secretary of State for the provinces, tells Parliament, in order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. So that was kind of the stance, was that if we were going to civilize the First Nations people, then we had to separate them. So this is kind of horrible. 1885, amendment to the Indian Act. Traditional Indian ceremonies such as the potlatches and the sun dance are prohibited. So here they're including little pictures of the exact laws as they were created. So you kind of see what how it looks. 1907, that's the medical inspector, Dr. Bryce, reports that health conditions in residential schools are a national crime. So this was not, like, people were not, I won't say people at large, but there were people in authority who saw what was happening and were horrified. They either did not do enough to fight it, or the government simply did not listen and did not care. 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, makes residential school attendance compulsory, in other words, mandatory, for children between the ages of 7 and 15. So this man was a very racist guy. There's a lot of really terrible quotes from him. And he was hugely responsible for residential schools and what they kind of became. 1951, major revisions are made to the Indian Act. Women are allowed to participate in band democracy, and the prohibitions on traditional Aboriginal practices and ceremonies are removed. Not really sure what happened in 1951 that caused that to be so. I think that's awesome. I just don't know what happened there. 1958. So this is great. Look at this. Indian Affairs regional inspectors recommend the abolition, in other words, getting rid of the residential schools. So way back then, they were like, nope, these are wrong. We need to get rid of them. Boy, I don't know if this is Cat Lake, but this picture right here looks so much like Cat Lake to me. Gosh. 1961, amendment to the Indian Act, status Indians can vote without having to give up their status. So this was one of those things that used to exist where First Nations people were not allowed to vote in elections unless they gave up their status. So they had to trade one right for another right, unfortunately. But then they finally changed that in 1961. And then 1982, Constitution Act is amended and now recognizes and affirms the rights of Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. Before, Métis were not necessarily included in the Indian Act. I believe, if I'm saying that correctly. And I don't know about the Inuit. There was like loopholes where people were being denied their rights because they didn't quite qualify as the strict definition of First Nations. During 1986 to 1994, the United Church, the Catholic Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, the Anglican Church, and the Presbyterian Church all issue formal apologies for their participation in the residential school system. And then 1996, the final report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is released. It calls for a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools on generations of Aboriginal people. And then between 1996 and 1998, class action lawsuits begin to appear against the government and churches, including those headed by Willie Blackwater and Nora Bernard. Then 2005, Assembly of First Nations National Chief Phil Fontaine announces a class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada over the legacy of the residential schools. And then 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for the residential school system. That's a picture of the Canadian Parliament when that was happening. 2009, as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is launched and hosts events all over the country to listen to Canadians who want to share their residential school stories. 2010, first TRC national event held in Winnipeg, Manitoba. 2013, signing ceremony which officially recognizes the University of Manitoba and its partners as the permanent host of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. 2014, the final TRC national event held in Edmonton, Alberta. And then finally in 2015, the closing ceremonies of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this went on for years and years of listening to this and kind of gathering the story and gathering the information. So kind of long, but I just kind of wanted you to know that. Was it useful? Yeah, I myself found it really useful because it explained a lot of stuff that I didn't know. Did you think the primary documents were important? I did, because it also kind of gives you ideas of, like, if I wanted to look up the entire document and read it for myself, it's written in pretty plain language. I thought it'd be harder to understand, like more legalistic or old-fashioned, but it doesn't really seem to be. So I feel like that's kind of useful because if I wanted to do more research, they're giving me the tools to do so. Would the information be more effectively presented in a paragraph? I feel like no. I feel like the pictures of what's going on, I feel like the documents that's going on, I feel like being able to focus on that bit by bit, to me, made it way easier to understand. I think if it had been in a paragraph, it would have been too much information at once, and I don't feel like I could have processed it well. Like, still, I would want to go back and read more, to be honest. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move to something kind of specific. Ooh, we're kind of running out of a little time. We might not get to everything today, but we'll try this. Very famous Indigenous Canadian writer called Rita Joe. Rita Joe is a famous Indigenous Canadian writer born in 1932 and died in 2007. She began writing in the 1960s with her first work being published in the 70s. She is well known for many publications such as The Poems of Rita Joe, The Song of Eskasoni, and The Song of Rita Joe, Autobiography of a Mi'kmaq Poet. She was well known for writing about her experiences in residential schools and growing up Indigenous, while also talking about peace and healing. In addition to a number of honorary doctorates, Rita Joe has received many awards and honors, such as the Member of the Order of Canada, the Member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada, and the National Aboriginal Achievement Award, which is now called the Inspire Award. Okay, so key question number 30, poem I Lost My Talk. This one is worth 15 marks. Consider the following poem by Rita Joe, a Mi'kmaq poet, about attending the residential school in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. This poem was written 30 years before the apology by Stephen Harper. As you read, think about the effect the school had on her. Questions will be marked using the answering questions rubric. I lost my talk, the talk you took away, when I was a little girl at Shubenacadie school. You snatched it away. I speak like you. I think like you. I create like you. This scrambled ballad about my world. Two ways I talk. Both ways I say. Your way is more powerful. So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. So What do you think? Oh, in your unit, there will be numbers for this. Somehow the numbers have disappeared here. What do you think the poet means when she says she has lost her talk? 2, when the poet is talking to you, who is she speaking to? Number 3, how does she feel like the school changed her? Number 4, how does she want to change the future? On YouTube, there's a video song called He Can Fancy Dance. I'm not going to pull it up. Sorry, I don't know why it came up twice. The video, there's a link there, but if you also put in He Can Fancy Dance, it will come up. This song echoes some of the exact same concerns as Rita Joe's poem. What are some of the ways that the boy is changed by the school? Okay. And then what has changed by the end of the song, He Can Fancy Dance? What happened that caused him to change? I'm going to kind of just go there so you can see what it looks like. Okay. So this song, hang on, is it's written by Cindy Paul. It comes up a few times, but you want to grab the one that it's also by Cindy Paul. There's some really good photos that go with this one. There's also, I believe, a live version of this, of her singing it as well. I'm not playing it for the plain and simple reason that YouTube is very strict about these kind of things right now, and I don't want them to block me from doing stuff. But yeah, please take a look at that before you answer those questions. What has changed by the end of the song, and what happened that caused him to change? Why did he change? I'm going to point out kind of in brackets this one. We've talked about inferring, okay? You will have to do some inferencing here and draw your own conclusions. By that I mean, they don't necessarily come right out and say, this happened. They sort of are implying something, and you have to kind of listen to it and make up your own mind what you think happens. I think that she's maybe left it a little bit deliberately ambiguous so that people can interpret it the way you want. I can think of at least 2 ways to interpret the event she just talks about. So I think, I don't know if we'll have time to, yeah, we won't. That's enough for today. On Wednesday, we'll take a look at question 31 and 32, which will look a little bit at more of the history of residential schools and the impact. And then we'll look at the apology of Stephen Harper and how that changed or did not change things in your opinion. Okay. If you have any questions, reach out to me and I'd love to hear. And I'll be here for a little while. Take care, and I will talk to you guys again on Wednesday.